How did a traitor save the Bible? This man betrayed his own people. He handed military secrets over to the enemy. He dined with the emperors who burned Jerusalem. The Jews called him a turncoat. The Romans did not trust him. And yet, without him, you would know almost nothing about the destruction of the temple, about Masada, about Herod, about the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. And most importantly, without him, there would be no historical proof of Jesus outside the Bible. None. His name was Flavius Josephus, and what he did to survive will shock you. But to understand what Flavius Josephus did, you need to understand the world into which he was born. We are in the 1st century. Judea is a powder keg. On one side, the Roman Empire, the greatest war machine the ancient world had ever seen. Invincible legions, roads that cut across continents, an emperor who considers himself divine. On the other side, a small, stubborn people who refuse to worship any god but their own. A people who believe in an ancient promise. A Messiah will come, and he will liberate Israel. This tension is not new. It has lasted for generations. Herod the Great, the very one whom the Bible says ordered the slaughter of the innocents, ruled Judea as a client king of Rome. He rebuilt the Second Temple on a monumental scale, but he also massacred his own family out of paranoia. When Herod died, Rome divided the kingdom among his sons. None of them were worthy. The people groaned under brutal taxes. Roman governors plundered the temple. They profaned sacred traditions. And in the midst of all this, movements arose. Many movements. The Pharisees wanted religious purity and obedience to the law. The Sadducees controlled the temple and made deals with Rome. The Essenes withdrew into the desert, waiting for the end of the age. And the Zealots? They wanted blood. They wanted to drive Rome out by force. Some of them, the Sicarii, carried daggers hidden in their garments and assassinated collaborators in broad daylight. It was in this cauldron that Christianity was born. It was in this world that John the Baptist preached in the wilderness, that Jesus was crucified, that the Apostle Paul wrote his letters, and it was in this exact setting that a boy was born in Jerusalem, around the year 37 after Christ, the son of an aristocratic priestly family, descended from the Maccabees on his mother's side, educated in the scriptures from childhood. His name was Yosef ben Matityahu, and he was destined to witness the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history. But before that, he would have to choose a side. Yosef ben Matityahu was not born just anyone. He was born at the absolute top of Jewish society. His family belonged to the first of the 24 priestly courses, the course of Jehoiarib, and this was not merely an honorary title, it was real power. Religious, political, and economic power. Let me explain what it meant to be a priest in Jerusalem in the 1st century. The temple was not just a place of prayer. It was the pulsing heart of the entire Jewish nation. It was bank, court, parliament, and sanctuary, all at the same time. An enormous amount of money flowed through it. Every year, Jews from across the known world, from Babylon to Spain, from Egypt to Asia Minor, sent the temple tax. Half a shekel of silver per person. Historians estimate that more than 1 million pilgrims visited Jerusalem during Passover. Each one needed to buy animals for sacrifice, lambs, doves, oxen, and they could only purchase them with temple currency, which meant exchanging Roman money for sacred shekels, paying an exchange fee to the money changers. Who controlled this flow? The priests. Who decided which animals were pure enough for the altar? The priests. Who managed the storehouses of grain, wine, and oil that sustained the entire sacrificial system? The priests. Josephus's family had been at the center of all this for generations, but it was not only religious power. On his mother's side, Josephus descended from the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees, the very warriors who, 200 years earlier, had expelled the Seleucid Greeks and purified the temple. The festival of Hanukkah still celebrates that victory. Royal blood and priestly blood flowed in the same veins. In any ancient society, this would have been a lethal combination of prestige. But in 1st century Judea, it meant even more. It meant that Josephus had direct access to the innermost circles of Jewish power, and by extension, to the Romans who oversaw everything, and the boy knew how to use it. From an early age, Josephus displayed an intelligence that impressed his elders. He himself claims, and here we must be cautious, because Josephus loved to praise himself, that by the age of 14, he was already being consulted by the chief priests on interpretations of the Mosaic law. Experienced rabbis came to him with questions. Exaggeration? Probably, but there was truth in it. His education was exceptional, even by elite standards. Complete memorization of the Torah, intensive study of the oral tradition that would later become the Talmud, mastery of liturgical Hebrew, everyday Aramaic, and eventually Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, training in rhetoric, logic, and debate, deep knowledge of the laws of ritual purity that governed every aspect of priestly life. A priest needed to know when a vessel became unclean, which skin blemishes indicated leprosy, how to examine the lungs of a sacrificed animal, how many steps one could take on the Sabbath, which words to pronounce when slitting a lamb's throat. It was a technical, meticulous, obsessive education. But Josephus did not want to be just another competent priest. At 16, he made a decision that reveals much about his character. He decided to personally experience the three main currents of Judaism. It was not enough to study Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes from scrolls. He wanted to live as each of them lived. Why? Perhaps genuine curiosity. Perhaps political calculation. A leader must understand every faction. Perhaps spiritual ambition. Most likely, a mixture of all three. Let us understand who these groups were. The Sadducees were the temple aristocracy. Wealthy, influential, pragmatic, priestly families. They rejected the oral tradition and accepted only the written Torah as authority. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, nor in angels, nor in destiny. Man was master of his own choices. Politically, they collaborated with Rome. After all, their power depended on the temple, and the temple functioned only with Roman permission. The Pharisees were different. They came primarily from the urban middle class, merchants, craftsmen, scribes. They believed in the oral tradition as much as in the written law. They taught the resurrection, the final judgment, the existence of angels and demons. Their focus was the holiness of everyday life. How to eat, how to pray, how to keep the Sabbath. They held enormous influence over the common people. Jesus, incidentally, debated Pharisees more than any other group, precisely because they were closer to him theologically. And the Essenes? They were the radicals of purity. Most lived in isolated communities, the most famous at Qumran, near the Dead Sea. They were the ones who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in caves near the ruins of their settlement. They practiced celibacy, communal ownership of goods, constant ritual washings. They believed the temple in Jerusalem was corrupt, and that they were the true sons of light, awaiting an apocalyptic war against the sons of darkness. Josephus spent time with each group. He studied their doctrines, he participated in their rituals, and he was satisfied with none of them. Then he heard of a hermit named Bannus. Bannus belonged to no sect. He lived alone in the Judean wilderness, the same wilderness where John the Baptist had preached a few years earlier. He clothed himself only in leaves and tree bark. He fed on plants that grew wild. He bathed repeatedly in cold water, day and night, seeking constant purification. It was a brutal lifestyle, scorching heat by day, bitter cold at night, absolute solitude, extreme physical deprivation. Josephus went to him and stayed 3 years. 3 years. A young aristocrat, heir to one of the most privileged families in Jerusalem, living as a beggar in the desert, sleeping in caves, eating roots, immersing himself in icy water before dawn. What was he seeking? Some historians suggest a genuine spiritual crisis. Second Temple Judaism was fragmented into dozens of rival interpretations. Perhaps Josephus sought something purer, more authentic, far from the political corruption of Jerusalem. Others see calculation. A future leader needed credentials no one could question. 3 years in the desert with an ascetic master gave Josephus an aura of holiness his priestly rivals lacked. Most likely, both are true at the same time. When he returned to Jerusalem at 19, Josephus was a different man. He had seen the world from the outside. He had experienced the rigor of the Essenes, the discipline of the Pharisees, the total isolation of the hermits, and he made his choice. He aligned himself with the Pharisees. Why? Because the Pharisees were the future. Josephus saw what many did not. The Sadducees depended entirely on the temple. If the temple fell, they would vanish. The Essenes were too pure to govern. They preferred to wait for the apocalypse rather than dirty their hands with politics. The Zealots wanted war, but had no chance against Rome. The Pharisees, however, had something no other group possessed: resilience. Their authority did not come from a stone building. It came from interpretation of the law, from synagogues scattered in every village, from the loyalty of the common people. If everything collapsed, and Josephus already suspected it would, the Pharisees would survive. It was a calculated bet, and it was correct, but that would come later. Around the year 64, when Josephus was 26, an unexpected opportunity arose. Some Jewish priests had been imprisoned by the Roman governor Antonius Felix, the same Felix mentioned in the book of Acts, who kept the apostle Paul in custody for 2 years. The reasons were vague, probably political. What mattered was that these men needed to be freed, and Josephus volunteered for the mission, a diplomatic embassy to Rome, the capital of the world, the center of imperial power. It was the chance of a lifetime. The journey began badly. The ship carrying Josephus across the Adriatic Sea was wrecked in the middle of the night. 600 people aboard, total darkness. Freezing water, panic. Josephus swam all night. He survived clinging to debris until dawn, when another ship rescued him. He arrived at the port of Puteoli, modern Pozzuoli, near Naples, soaked, exhausted, but alive. The first sign that this man had a special talent for escaping death. And then, finally, he saw Rome. No text can capture the impact the city had on visitors from the East. Jerusalem was impressive, yes. Herod's temple was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. But Jerusalem had perhaps 150,000 inhabitants at the time. Rome had 1 million. 1 million people packed into a city without urban planning. Insulae, apartment buildings 5 or 6 stories high, crowded into dark alleys. Fires were constant. The Great Fire of Rome would occur that very year, 64, destroying 10 of the city's 14 districts. Nero would blame the Christians and begin the first imperial persecution. But alongside the misery, there was splendor. The Roman Forum, where Cicero had spoken and Julius Caesar had been assassinated. The Circus Maximus, capable of holding 250,000 spectators for chariot races. Aqueducts bringing water from mountains 80 kilometers away. Public baths with heated pools, libraries, gardens. Marble temples dedicated to gods Josephus considered empty idols. And on the Palatine Hill, the imperial palace. There lived Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus. Nero, the emperor who murdered his own mother, who kicked his pregnant wife to death, who performed publicly as a singer and actor, a scandal to the Roman aristocracy, who accumulated lovers of both sexes, who squandered fortunes on banquets where rose petals rained down and flamingo tongues were served. How could a young Jewish priest from Jerusalem get close to a man like that? Josephus found an unlikely path. In Rome, he met a Jewish actor named Aliturus. Actors in the Roman world occupied a strange position, socially despised, yet often intimate with the powerful. Aliturus was Nero's personal favorite. He performed in the emperor's private shows. He had access to the imperial chambers. Through Aliturus, Josephus was introduced to Poppaea Sabina, the empress. Poppaea was a fascinating woman. Beautiful, ambitious, intelligent. She had been Nero's mistress before becoming his wife. For that to happen, the emperor had to kill his first wife, Octavia. Poppaea was known for bathing in donkey's milk to preserve her skin. She traveled with an entourage of 500 donkeys to ensure a constant supply. But the detail that mattered to Josephus, Poppaea was sympathetic to Judaism. She was what Jews called a God-fearer. A Gentile who respected the God of Israel, observed some Jewish practices, but did not formally convert. There were many such people in the Roman Empire. The Synagogue of Rome attracted aristocrats curious about this exotic religion that rejected images and worshipped a single, invisible God. Josephus won Poppaea's favor. How? We do not know exactly. Personal charm, theological arguments, gifts, probably a combination of all three. The result, the imprisoned priests were released. Mission accomplished. Josephus returned to Jerusalem in the year 65, carrying gifts from the empress and carrying something far more valuable than gold: information. He had seen the empire from the inside. He had walked the corridors of power. He had observed how the Romans thought, how they decided, how they crushed their enemies, and he understood a brutal truth that most of his countrymen refused to accept. Rome was not merely strong, Rome was invincible. The Roman legions were not just soldiers. They were engineers. They built roads, bridges, fortified camps. Each legionary carried equipment to construct a complete fort in a matter of hours. Roman logistics could move entire armies across continents. Josephus did the math. Judea had perhaps 2.5 million inhabitants. The Roman Empire ruled 70 million. The legions numbered nearly 300,000 professional soldiers, trained, equipped, disciplined. The zealots had courage. They had faith. They had daggers hidden in their garments. They had no chance. Josephus kept this conclusion to himself. It was not the kind of thing one said aloud in Jerusalem, where hatred of Rome boiled in the streets, and any suspicion of sympathy for the occupiers could mean a Sicarii dagger in the back. But he knew. If war came, and the signs were increasingly clear that it would, Israel would be destroyed. The problem was that the war did not wait. In May of 66, the Roman governor Gessius Florus plundered the temple treasury. 17 talents of gold. A fortune. The people revolted. Florus sent soldiers. There was massacre. More revolt. More massacre. And then, something no one expected. The rebels won. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem was surrounded and annihilated. The governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, marched with an entire legion to crush the revolt, and was defeated in an ambush at Beth Horon. The Jews had defeated a Roman legion. For the first time in generations, it seemed possible. It seemed God was on their side. It seemed the messianic prophecies were being fulfilled. The great Jewish revolt had begun, and Josephus, the man who knew it would all end in catastrophe, was appointed military commander of Galilee. The appointment was absurd. Josephus was 29 years old. He had never commanded an army. He had never fought in a battle. His military experience was zero. And the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem, the supreme council of the Jews, handed him the most vulnerable region in all Judea, Galilee. Why? Politics. Always politics. Jerusalem was divided into factions that hated each other almost as much as they hated Rome. There were moderates who wanted to negotiate. There were zealots who wanted total war. There were Sicarii who assassinated anyone who spoke of peace. There were aristocratic priests trying to maintain some control. There were popular leaders competing for power. Josephus belonged to the moderate faction, or at least that is what it seemed. Sending him to Galilee solved two problems at once. First, it put the most exposed region under some kind of centralized command. Second, it removed from Jerusalem a young, ambitious aristocrat who could cause trouble. If he succeeded, great. If he failed, the blame would be his. Josephus accepted. Perhaps out of ambition, perhaps out of duty, perhaps because refusing would have been even more dangerous than accepting. In that climate of revolutionary paranoia, any hesitation could be interpreted as treason. In the winter of 66 to 67, Josephus set out north, and he found chaos. Galilee was not a unified region. It was a mosaic of villages, cities, ethnicities, and conflicting loyalties. Jews lived alongside Greeks, Syrians, and Phoenicians. Some towns were predominantly Jewish. Others were mixed. Others were hostile to Jews. Sepphoris, the largest city in the region, refused to join the revolt. It chose loyalty to Rome. Tiberias, founded by Herod Antipas on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, was divided. Part of the population wanted to fight, part wanted to negotiate. Gishala, in the far north, had its own local leader who had no intention of obeying anyone. That leader was named John of Gishala. Remember him? I mentioned him earlier. The rivalry between Josephus and John is one of the most intense and least told stories of this entire period. John was everything Josephus was not. Josephus came from the priestly aristocracy of Jerusalem. John was an olive oil merchant from the Galilean countryside. Josephus had refined education, political connections, royal blood. John had survivors' cunning, smuggling networks, and a militia of loyal peasants. Josephus saw the war as an inevitable catastrophe that had to be managed. John saw the war as an opportunity for power, for vengeance, for glory. The two hated each other from the first meeting. John accused Josephus of being an impostor sent by Jerusalem to control Galilee. He said the young priest was too soft, too cowardly, too Roman. He spread rumors that Josephus planned to betray the revolt. Josephus, in his writings, portrays John as a greedy, lying, bloodthirsty bandit, a demagogue who manipulated the people for his own ends, a man without scruples who would murder anyone who stood in his way. Who was right? Probably neither of them, or both at the same time. What we do know is that John tried to kill Josephus at least 4 times. On one occasion, he sent assassins disguised as supplicants. On another, he convinced the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem to remove Josephus from command. A delegation was sent to arrest him. Josephus managed to reverse the situation through political maneuvering and popular support. It was Game of Thrones in real time, 2,000 years before George R.R. Martin.
Meanwhile, Josephus tried to do the impossible, prepare Galilee for a Roman invasion. He had few resources. The volunteers he managed to gather were mostly peasants with no military training. There was no money for equipment. There was no time to build proper fortifications. Josephus improvised. According to his own account, and here we need caution again, he organized an army of over 100,000 men. He divided them into units following the Roman model. He taught them trumpet signals, battle formations, marching discipline. He fortified the main cities, Jotapata, Tiberias, Taricheae, Giscala. The numbers are certainly exaggerated. 100,000 soldiers would be more than any Jewish army in history. Modern historians estimate something between 20 and 60,000, and most with no real training. But Josephus did something. He created some kind of structure. He tried to turn a crowd of armed peasants into something that could at least slow the Roman advance. He knew he could not win. The question was how long he could hold out. The answer came in the spring of 67. Nero, furious over the defeat of Cestius Gallus, summoned his best general, Titus Flavius Vespasian. Vespasian was not an aristocrat. He came from a middle-class family in central Italy, tax collectors and mule breeders. He had risen through the military ranks by sheer merit. He had commanded legions in Germania and in Britain. He was known for 3 things: absolute competence, brutal discipline, and legendary stinginess. Nero chose him precisely because he did not seem like a political threat. A general without noble lineage could not aspire to the imperial throne, or so Nero thought. Vespasian assembled an army of approximately 60,000 men. 3 full legions, the 5th Macedonica, the 10th Fretensis, and the 15th Apollinaris, plus auxiliary troops from allied kingdoms, Syrian archers, Arab cavalry, infantry from across the region, plus engineers, physicians, and artillery specialists trained in siege machines. His son Titus, the same man who would later destroy Jerusalem, commanded one of the legions. It was the largest military force the region had seen in decades, and it marched straight into Galilee. Cities fell like dominoes. Sepphoris opened its gates without a fight. It had chosen Rome from the start. Gabara was taken in a single assault. Jotapata would be next. Josephus was in Tiberias when he learned that Vespasian was marching against Jotapata. The city had asked for his help. He could have fled to Jerusalem. He could have hidden in some remote village. He could have abandoned Galilee to its fate. Instead, he entered Jotapata. Why? That is one of the most intriguing questions about Josephus. Some say it was honor. A commander does not abandon his men. Others say it was calculation. If he fled, the zealots in Jerusalem would execute him for cowardice. Others still suggest that Josephus was already planning to surrender to the Romans and wanted to do it in a way that looked heroic. We will never know his true motivation. What we do know is that in May of 67, Flavius Josephus, priest, aristocrat, diplomat, locked himself inside a doomed city, and the siege of Jotapata began.
Vespasian surrounded the city with his legions. He built a circumvallation wall to prevent any escape or reinforcements. He positioned siege engines, catapults hurling 30-kilogram stones, ballistae firing bolts capable of piercing shields and armor, a massive battering ram protected by wooden structures. The defenders resisted with everything they had. Josephus describes battles on the walls, night sorties to set Roman machines on fire, boiling oil poured down on soldiers trying to scale the ramparts. He describes how the people of Jotapata threw wet hay onto the siege ramp to absorb the impact of the ram, how they dug tunnels to undermine Roman structures. 47 days. 47 days the small city held out against the best army in the world. Archaeology confirms much of what Josephus wrote. Excavations at Yodfat, the modern Hebrew name for Jotapata, have uncovered Roman arrowheads, catapult projectiles, remains of the assault ramp, a mass grave with about 30 bodies, men, women, children, evidence of hastily built fortifications. The population figures Josephus gives are exaggerated. He speaks of 40,000 dead, but the city likely had no more than 7,000 inhabitants. But the resistance was real. The suffering was real. And on the 47th day, Jotapata fell. A deserter told the Romans that the guards dozed just before dawn, exhausted after nights on watch. Titus led an elite unit in the silence of the early morning. They climbed the wall. They killed the sleeping sentries. They opened the gates. The massacre was total. Vespasian had ordered that there be no prisoners. The Roman soldiers, frustrated by 47 days of siege, unleashed their fury. Men were slaughtered in the streets. Women and children were hunted down in houses and hiding places. Blood ran through the stone alleys. Josephus describes the scene in horrific detail. Bodies piled up, houses burning, screams he could hear from his hiding place. His hiding place. Because Josephus did not die at Jotapata, as the city burned, he and 40 companions descended into an underground cistern, a concealed cave connected to a system of tunnels with stored water and food. The Romans did not find them immediately. They searched the city for days, killing survivors, collecting plunder. Vespasian wanted Josephus alive. The enemy commander was a valuable trophy. And then, a woman betrayed the hiding place. Roman soldiers surrounded the entrance to the cave. A tribune named Nicanor, who knew Josephus from earlier, perhaps from Rome, was sent to negotiate surrender. He promised that Josephus's life would be spared. Josephus wanted to surrender. His companions did not. And here we come to the darkest and most controversial moment in this entire story. 41 men in a dark cave. Outside, the most powerful army in the world waited. Inside, despair had taken over. Josephus wanted to surrender. He had received assurances from Nicanor. His life would be spared. He would be treated with dignity. It was the rational choice. The city had fallen. The war in Galilee was lost. Dying there would save no one. But for his companions, surrender was unthinkable. You need to understand the mindset of these men. They had seen what the Romans did to prisoners. Crucifixion was their favorite method, a slow, humiliating, agonizing death that could drag on for days. Slavery was the fate of the survivors, families torn apart, men sold to mines and galleys, women to brothels, children to the slave market. And there was something deeper.
For a devout first-century Jew, surrendering to pagans was betrayal not only of the people, but of God. The Maccabees had preferred death to submission. The tradition of Jewish martyrs went back centuries, men and women who chose to die rather than violate the law or worship idols. Josephus's companions appealed to that tradition. They said death was preferable to slavery, that they should die as free men, not as chained animals, that God would receive them as heroes, and they proposed a pact of collective suicide. Josephus tried to dissuade them. He argued that suicide was sin. The law forbade taking one's own life. He argued that there was hope. Perhaps they could escape. Perhaps they could negotiate. He argued that dying unnecessarily was not courage, it was waste. It did not work. His companions became furious. They called him a coward. They called him a traitor. Some drew their swords and threatened to kill him right there, before he could surrender to the Romans. Josephus saw death in their eyes. And then, this is the moment that defines his entire life. He made a proposal. If we are going to die, he said, let us do it in an orderly way. Let us not kill ourselves like animals in panic. Let us draw lots. Each man will draw a number. Whoever draws the first number kills the second. Whoever draws the third kills the fourth. And so on, until only one remains. A lottery of death. The companions accepted. Why? Perhaps because the method gave the act an appearance of dignity. Perhaps because Josephus, even in that extreme moment, could still persuade. Perhaps because they were too desperate to think clearly. The lots were drawn. One by one, the men began to die.
What happened in that cave over the following hours is impossible to know with certainty.
Josephus is our only source, and he had every reason in the world to distort the truth. What he says is this: the men formed a circle. They counted by threes. Every third man was killed by the one before him. Bodies piled up on the floor of the cistern. Blood ran over the stones. The air grew heavy with the smell of death. And when it came to Josephus, he survived. Out of 41 men, 2 remained. Josephus and one other. Coincidence? Luck? Divine providence? Or mathematics? Here enters one of the most fascinating details of this story. The so-called Josephus problem is now a classic in mathematics and computer science. The question is simple. In a circle of n people, eliminating every kth person, which position must you occupy to be the last survivor? With 41 people and counting by threes, the safe positions are 16 and 31. Josephus was an educated man. He had training in logic and calculation. It is possible, some would say likely, that he calculated exactly where to place himself in the circle. He manipulated the drawing. A Slavonic version of his work, discovered centuries later, contains a revealing line. He counted the numbers with cunning, and thus deceived them all. That line does not appear in the Greek versions. Was it censored? Added later? We will never know. What we do know is that Josephus and his final companion were alive, surrounded by 39 corpses, swords in hand. It was time to fulfill the pact. One would have to kill the other. The survivor would then have to kill himself. Josephus did not do it. He convinced the other man to surrender with him. How? What arguments did he use? What promises did he make? The text does not say. Only that the two of them came out of the cave with their hands raised. The Roman soldiers brought them to Vespasian.
Imagine the scene. The Roman general seated in his command tent. A veteran of decades of war. Hard eyes, a face weathered by the sun of 3 continents. Around him, tribunes and centurions waiting to see the famous prisoner. And before him, a 30-year-old man, covered in blood and dust, thin from the hunger of the siege, trembling with exhaustion. Vespasian ordered him chained. Josephus would be sent to Rome as a trophy. Nero would certainly enjoy seeing the rebel commander humiliated, but before the chains were fastened, Josephus asked to speak privately with the general. Vespasian agreed. He ordered everyone out of the tent, except his son Titus and 2 trusted friends. And then Josephus said something that changed his life.
and possibly the history of the world. You think, Vespasian, that you have captured only a prisoner, but I come to you as a messenger of greater things. If I were not sent by God, I would know the law of the Jews and know how a general ought to die." Vespasian frowned. What kind of speech was this? Josephus continued, "You will send me to Nero. Why? How long will Nero and his successors before you remain in power? You, Vespasian, will be Caesar. You will be emperor. You and this your son." Absolute silence in the tent. Josephus had just prophesied that an obscure general from an ordinary family would become lord of Rome. Was it madness? Blasphemy? A desperate attempt to buy time? Vespasian did not believe it. Not immediately. He suspected it was a trick. Prisoners said anything to save their skin. But he did not kill Josephus. Something about those words stayed with him. Perhaps because Vespasian, like any Roman, believed in omens. Perhaps because other oracles had said similar things. Eastern prophecies spoke of a world ruler who would come from Judea. Perhaps because, deep down, the old general desired more than he would ever admit. Josephus was kept as a prisoner, but with privileged treatment. He was not sent to Rome. He remained in the Roman camp, chained but alive. And he waited. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Vespasian continued the campaign in Judea. He took city after city, Jotapata, Tarichae, Gamala, Giscala. John of Giscala, Josephus's rival, fled to Jerusalem, where he would become one of the leaders of the final resistance. Meanwhile, Rome was imploding. Nero, increasingly paranoid and unpopular, faced a rebellion from the legions of Gaul and Spain. In June of 68, the Senate declared him a public enemy. Nero fled Rome and killed himself with the help of a servant. His last words, "What an artist dies with me." What came next was chaos. In a single year, 69 after Christ, 4 different men wore the imperial purple. History calls it the year of the 4 emperors. Galba came first, governor of Spain, old and severe. He lasted 7 months. He was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, which sold the throne to Otho. Otho lasted 3 months. The legions of the Rhine proclaimed their own commander, Vitellius. The 2 armies met in northern Italy. Otho lost and killed himself. Vitellius was an idle glutton. He spent months in banquets while the empire fell apart. He did not see the storm forming in the east, because in the east, the legions of Syria, Egypt, and Judea were moving. And the man they wanted was Vespasian. In July of 69, Tiberius Julius Alexander, the prefect of Egypt, Jewish by birth but Roman at heart, proclaimed Vespasian emperor. The legions of Judea followed immediately. Syria joined. Suddenly, half the Roman army backed the old general. Vespasian's forces marched on Rome. Vitellius tried to negotiate, was betrayed, dragged through the streets, tortured, and killed. His body was thrown into the Tiber. In December of 69, Vespasian was master of Rome. Josephus's prophecy had come true. Remember the chains? The ones Josephus had worn since Jotapata? Vespasian ordered them broken with an axe. Not merely removed, broken into pieces. It was a symbolic gesture. It meant Josephus should never have been chained, that he was not a prisoner, but a prophet. Josephus received Roman citizenship. He received the name of the imperial family, Flavius, in honor of the Flavian dynasty Vespasian was founding. From now on, Yosef ben Matityahu would be known as Titus Flavius Josephus, a Jew with the name of a Roman emperor. The transformation was complete. The rebel general who had fought Rome was now the emperor's personal protege. The priest of the temple in Jerusalem now lived in imperial quarters. The commander of Jotapata now wore a Roman toga and attended banquets on the Palatine. The Jews had a word for people like that: traitor. But the story was not over. Jerusalem still resisted, the temple still stood, and Josephus would watch its destruction from the Roman side. Vespasian left for Rome to consolidate his power. The task of finishing the war fell to his son, Titus Flavius Sabinus Vespasianus. Titus, 30 years old, handsome, charismatic, ruthless when necessary, commander of Legio 15 Apollinaris, future emperor. and at his side, as interpreter, advisor, and instrument of propaganda, stood Flavius Josephus. In the spring of AD 70, 4 Roman legions marched on Jerusalem. The city was torn apart. 3 Jewish factions were fighting one another as the Romans drew near. John of Gishala, Josephus's old rival, controlled the temple with his zealots. Simon Bar Giora, a charismatic leader many viewed as a messianic figure, dominated the upper city. Eleazar ben Simon, with a smaller band of zealots, held the inner court of the temple. 3 Jewish armies, 3 leaders who hated each other, and Rome was coming. The madness was total. While the legions built camps around the walls, the Jews inside the city burned one another's grain stores. They set fire to supplies that could have fed the population for years. They preferred famine to seeing their rivals well fed. Josephus watched it all from the Roman camp. What did he feel? Despair? Guilt? A bitter satisfaction at seeing his predictions confirmed. His writings suggest a mix of everything. He describes Jerusalem with evident love. The walls, the temple, the feasts, the crowds of pilgrims. And he describes its destruction with genuine horror. But he was also on the side of those destroying it. Titus used Josephus in a very specific way. Repeatedly, the Roman general sent his privileged prisoner up to the walls to negotiate surrender. Josephus would approach, shout in Aramaic, and beg the defenders to give up. Imagine the scene. A Jew dressed in Roman clothing, protected by Roman shields, speaking from beneath walls he himself had helped defend years earlier. Asking his own countrymen to abandon the fight, the response was predictable. Arrows, stones, insults. The defenders called Josephus a dog, a traitor, a sellout. On one occasion, a stone thrown from the wall struck him in the head and knocked him unconscious. The Romans had to drag him away while the Jews celebrated, but Josephus kept at it. Or Titus forced him to keep at it. He tried to reason with them. He said God had abandoned Jerusalem, that resistance was pointless, that Rome was invincible, that surrender would save lives. No one listened. The siege lasted 5 months. 5 months of absolute horror. The legions built assault ramps against the walls. The defenders burned them. The Romans built new ramps. Siege engines bombarded the city day and night. 30-kilogram stones flew over the walls, smashing homes and people. Inside Jerusalem, famine set in. The stores had been burned in the internal civil war. The Romans blocked any food from entering. The population, swollen by pilgrims who had come for Passover and were trapped by the siege, began to die of starvation. Josephus describes scenes that are difficult to read even today. Families fighting over crumbs, people eating leather, hay, dung, mothers hiding food from their own children, corpses thrown into the streets because there was no strength left to bury them, the stench of death hanging over the holy city. And then he tells a story that became the symbol of all that horror. A woman named Mary, from a wealthy family beyond the Jordan, was in Jerusalem when the siege began. The zealots looted her provisions. Hunger drove her mad. She took her infant son, killed him, roasted half the body, and ate it. When the zealots smelled the roast meat and came demanding their share, she showed them what was left of the child. "This is my own son, and this deed is mine. Eat, for I too have eaten. Do not be weaker than a woman, nor more compassionate than a mother." The men fled in horror. Josephus presents this story as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. Deuteronomy had warned that if Israel forsook God, mothers would eat their own children during sieges. But beyond its theological symbolism, it was Roman propaganda. It showed how far the Jews had fallen in their insane resistance. In August of AD 70, the legions breached the third wall. The battle for the temple was apocalyptic. The defenders fought with suicidal desperation. Every portico, every courtyard, every stairway was contested hand to hand. The Romans advanced over heaps of corpses. Blood ran down the marble steps. Titus, according to Josephus, wanted to preserve the temple. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Destroying it would be a waste. But in the heat of battle, a Roman soldier threw a torch through a golden window. The fire spread. The Temple of Jerusalem, rebuilt by Herod in gold and gleaming white marble, expanded over decades, the spiritual center of millions of Jews across the world, began to burn.
Titus tried to order the flames put out. At least, that is what Josephus claims. But the chaos was total. The soldiers were in a frenzy of blood and plunder. No one obeyed orders. The inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest entered once a year, was invaded by pagan legionaries. They looted the sacred objects. They tore the gold from the walls. They carried off the menorah, the table of the showbread, the Torah scrolls, and the fire consumed everything. It was the 9th of Av, AD 70, the very same day, according to Jewish tradition, that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the first temple 656 years earlier. Josephus was there. He saw the flames, he heard the screams, and he wrote, "While the temple was burning, the soldiers plundered everything they found and slaughtered all they captured. There was no pity for age, nor respect for dignity. Children and the aged, laymen and priests, were all killed alike. The war swept through every class of people, both those who begged for mercy and those who resisted. The number of dead is impossible to calculate precisely. Josephus speaks of 1,100,000 dead over the whole siege. Modern historians consider that figure exaggerated, but even conservative estimates speak of hundreds of thousands. The survivors were enslaved. The strongest were sent to mines in Egypt. Others were distributed through the arenas of the empire to die fighting wild beasts or gladiators. Handsome young men were sold for purposes Josephus does not specify. John of Gischala was captured in the tunnels beneath the city, trying to escape. He was taken to Rome for Titus's triumph, the military procession celebrating victory. He marched in chains through the streets of the imperial capital while the crowd insulted him. Then he was executed. Simon Bar Giora met the same fate. Thrown from the Tarpeian Rock in Rome after the triumph, the temple was never rebuilt. Not to this day. The destruction of AD 70 changed Judaism forever. Without the temple, there were no more sacrifices, no functioning priesthood, no physical center. The Judaism we know today, built on synagogues, rabbis, and the study of the law, was born from the ashes of that catastrophe. The Pharisees, whom Josephus had chosen decades earlier, became the leaders of spiritual rebuilding. But the war did not end completely in AD 70. 3 Herodian fortresses still resisted: Herodium, Machaerus, and Masada. Herodium and Machaerus fell quickly. Masada held out. Masada was a rock plateau in the Judean desert, on the shores of the Dead Sea. Herod had built an absurdly luxurious palace fortress there. Pools, hot baths, mosaics, storehouses that could sustain thousands of people for years. A band of Sicarii, radicals among radicals, had seized the fortress early in the revolt and massacred the Roman garrison. After Jerusalem fell, other refugees joined them. Whole families, nearly 1,000 people. The commander was named Eleazar ben Yair. In AD 73 or 74, the exact date is debated, Legio ex Fretensis surrounded Masada. The siege seemed impossible. The rock rose 400 meters high. Its sides were sheer. There was only one access route, a narrow winding trail called the Serpent's Path. But the Romans did not know the word impossible. The governor Flavius Silva commanded the construction of a massive assault ramp. He used thousands of Jewish prisoners as labor. Stone upon stone, earth upon earth, the ramp climbed the western slope, where the cliff was only 90 meters high. Recent archaeological studies led by Dr. Guy Stiebel of Tel Aviv University revealed something surprising. The siege Josephus describes as lasting months or years was much shorter. The ramp took only a few weeks to build. The Romans came, saw, and conquered with brutal efficiency. When the ramp was ready and the Romans brought up their battering ram, Eleazar ben Yair gathered the defenders. The wall was about to fall. There was no more hope. By morning, the Romans would enter. Eleazar proposed collective suicide. Josephus reproduces, or invents, 2 long speeches by Eleazar persuading his people to die. The arguments are philosophical, almost Greek. The soul is immortal.
Death brings freedom. Slavery is worse than the end. 960 people, men, women, and children, died that night. First, the men killed their own families. Then 10 men chosen by lot killed all the others. Finally, one last man killed the remaining 9 and killed himself. The Romans entered the next morning expecting battle. They found silence and bodies. 2 women and 5 children survived, hidden in a cistern. They told the story to the Romans, and Josephus recorded it. For decades, Masada was a symbol of Jewish heroism. Israeli soldiers would swear an oath there: "Masada shall not fall again." But modern historians increasingly question the narrative. The Sicarii of Masada were terrorists who murdered other Jews. The mass suicide may not have happened as Josephus describes, or it may not have happened at all. Archaeology has found skeletons, but in far smaller numbers than expected. Josephus's narrative has internal contradictions, and he was not there. He depended on second or third-hand reports. What is real? What is propaganda? What is literary invention? Those questions haunt Josephus's entire legacy.
While Jerusalem burned and Masada resisted, Flavius Josephus was building his new life in Rome. Vespasian gave him an apartment in the imperial palace, the emperor's own former residence before taking the throne. He gave him an annual pension. He gave him land in conquered Judea, exempt from taxes. He gave him full Roman citizenship with all its privileges. Josephus lived under the protection of 3 consecutive emperors: Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, the entire Flavian dynasty. But he did not live in peace. In Rome, he was neither Roman nor Jew. The Romans suspected him, an Eastern barbarian who had fought against them. The Jews despised him, a traitor who had watched the temple's destruction from the enemy's side. His personal life was turbulent. He married 4 times. His first wife was lost during the siege of Jotapata, probably killed or enslaved. The second was a captured Jewish woman Vespasian assigned to him. She left him as soon as he was freed. The third was a Jewish woman from Alexandria. They had 3 sons, only one of whom survived childhood. Josephus divorced her. The fourth was a Jewish aristocrat from Crete, with whom he had 2 more sons. The pattern is revealing. Josephus tried to maintain ties with the Jewish community through marriage, but those ties were fragile. Women left him. Children died. The man who survived the lottery of death lived surrounded by small domestic tragedies. And in the middle of all this, he wrote. This is where Josephus becomes indispensable to history. His first work was The Jewish War, 7 volumes on the Great Revolt, from its causes to the fall of Masada. He wrote it first in Aramaic, for Jews of the East living beyond the Euphrates in the Parthian Empire. Then he translated it into Greek. The work is propaganda, yes. Josephus worked for the Flavians. He needed to show that Roman victory was inevitable, that Jewish resistance was insane, that the destruction of the temple was the fault of Jewish radicals themselves, not Titus. But it is also eyewitness testimony. Josephus saw the sieges. He knew commanders on both sides. He walked through the smoking ruins of Jerusalem. No other source offers anything comparable. His second great work was Jewish Antiquities, 20 volumes on the history of the Jewish people, from the creation of the world to his own time. A monumental project, an attempt to explain the Jews to the Roman world. Josephus had a clear objective: to show that Judaism was an ancient, respectable, philosophical religion. Not a barbarian superstition, as many Romans believed. The Jews had a history older than Rome itself. Their laws were wise. Their God was the creator of the universe. It is in Antiquities that we find the most controversial passages about early Christianity. Josephus mentions John the Baptist. He describes him as a good man who urged the Jews to practice virtue and who was executed by Herod Antipas. Most historians accept this passage as authentic. Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. He describes James's execution by order of the high priest Ananus. This passage is also widely accepted. And then there is the Testimonium Flavianum, Book 18, Chapter 3, Paragraph 3. 63 Greek words that have generated more academic debate than any other text from antiquity. The passage, as it has come down to us, says this:
At that time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he performed astonishing deeds and was a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, at the accusation of the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him before did not cease, for he appeared to them on the third day, alive again, just as the divine prophets had foretold these, and countless other wonderful things about him. And even to this day, the tribe of Christians, so called because of him, has not disappeared. The problem is obvious. Josephus was a devout Jew. He would never have written, "He was the Christ." That would be admitting Jesus was the Messiah. He would never have stated the resurrection as fact. He would never have questioned whether Jesus was human. So what happened? The dominant theory today is partial interpolation. Josephus wrote something about Jesus, probably neutral or slightly negative. Medieval Christian copyists, in transmitting the text, added the most enthusiastic lines. If indeed one ought to call him a man, he was the Christ, the reference to the resurrection. Evidence supports this theory. An Arabic version of the text, discovered in 1971, says, "He was perhaps the Messiah," more plausible for a Jewish author. A 12th century Syriac version says, "He was believed to be the Christ," also more neutral. In 2025, the scholar T.C. Schmidt published a bombshell book with Oxford University Press, using computational stylistic analysis, comparing linguistic patterns in the Testimonium with Josephus's other works. Schmidt argues the passage is substantially authentic. The supposed interpolations are smaller than previously thought. The debate continues. It will probably never be definitively resolved. But one thing is certain. Without Josephus, we would have no mention of Jesus in non-Christian first-century sources. None. Tacitus mentions Christ briefly, but he wrote decades later. Pliny the Younger mentions Christians, not Jesus directly. Suetonius is ambiguous. Josephus is the only external witness contemporary, or nearly contemporary, to the world in which Jesus lived. His third important work was Against Appian, a defense of Judaism against anti-Semitic attacks. Appian was an Alexandrian grammarian who spread slanders against the Jews. He claimed they worshipped a donkey's head in the temple, that they kidnapped Greeks, fattened them for a year, and sacrificed them, eating their entrails, that they were misanthropes who hated all mankind. Anti-Semitism is not a modern invention. It was already virulent in the ancient world. Josephus dismantled each accusation systematically. He cited dozens of Greek and Roman authors as witnesses to Jewish antiquity and dignity. He presented the law of Moses as superior to Greek philosophy. He argued that Jews contributed positively to every society in which they lived. Against Appian is little read today, but it contains some of the most eloquent defenses of Jewish identity ever written. His final work was the autobiography, a personal defense against criticisms from another Jewish historian named Justus of Tiberias, who accused him of having caused the revolt in Galilee. Josephus died around AD 100. The exact date is unknown. Domitian was assassinated in 96, and with him ended the protection of the Flavian dynasty. Josephus likely did not survive long after that. He died in Rome, far from Jerusalem, far from the ruins of the temple, far from the land where he had been born. The Jews ignored him for centuries. His name does not appear in the Talmud, the Midrash, or any rabbinic literature of antiquity. The silence was deliberate. He was erased from collective memory. The Christians, ironically, preserved him. Josephus's manuscripts survived because medieval monks copied them, interested in the passages about Jesus, John the Baptist, and the context of the New Testament. The Church called him a near Christian. Some even called him a saint. Josephus would have found that funny, or tragic, or both. 2,000 years have passed. The temple remains in ruins. The western wall, A portion of the retaining wall Herod built is all that remains. Jews from all over the world go there to weep over a loss that happened 20 centuries ago. Rome fell. The empire fractured. The Flavians turned to dust. But Josephus's books survived. And this is where the story gets strange. The man his own countrymen called a traitor became, against all odds, the greatest preserver of ancient Jewish memory. Think about that. Without Josephus, we would know almost nothing about the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, the groups that shaped Judaism in the time of Jesus. We would not have detailed descriptions of Herod's temple, its architecture, its rituals, its magnificence. We would not know the political backstage of Roman Judea, the intrigues, the corrupt governors, the crushed revolts. Without Josephus, Masada would be just a rock in the desert. Herod would be just a name. The Great Revolt would be a footnote. And without Josephus, the debate over the historical Jesus would look completely different. When scholars try to reconstruct the world in which Jesus lived, the synagogues of Galilee, the tensions with Rome, the messianic expectations, the conflicts among Jewish sects, they open Josephus. There is no alternative. When Christian apologists want to prove Jesus existed outside the Gospels, they cite Josephus. It is exhibit number 1. When skeptics want to challenge that evidence, they also argue over Josephus. The Testimonium Flavianum is the battlefield. The traitor became indispensable. But the irony goes deeper. Modern Israel has a complicated relationship with Josephus. For decades, he was a national villain. The founders of the State of Israel needed heroes, warriors who fought to the death, who never surrendered, who chose liberty or death. Masada was the perfect symbol. Josephus was the anti-symbol. In Israeli schools, they held mock trials of Josephus. Students debated, traitor or survivor. Most convicted him. Soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces would climb Masada at dawn and swear, "Masada shall not fall again." The collective suicide was heroism. Josephus's surrender was shame. But something changed over the last few decades. Israeli historians began to question the Masada myth. The Sicarii who held the fortress were not exactly heroes. They were terrorists who murdered other Jews for collaborating with Rome. The mass suicide, if it happened, was imposed by leaders on reluctant families. Archaeology does not fully confirm Josephus's account, and Josephus, the traitor, began to be re-evaluated. Yes, he surrendered. Yes, he collaborated with Rome, but he also preserved, documented, bore witness. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, revered as a savior of Judaism, also surrendered to Vespasian. He also prophesied that the general would become emperor. He also received Roman favors. The difference is that ben Zakkai founded a religious academy in Yavna. Josephus wrote books in Rome. Both chose to survive. Both preserved something essential for future generations.
Jerusalem has a street named Yosef ben Matityahu. Not Flavius Josephus, the Roman name, but Yosef ben Matityahu, the Hebrew name. It is a partial rehabilitation, a late recognition that history is more complicated than heroes and villains. In 2021, an Israeli film called Legend of Destruction, Hebrew Agadat Choban, used Josephus's writings as its basis. 1,500 original paintings, animated. Oscar Isaac, Elliot Gould, and Evangeline Lilly voiced the English version. 4 Ophir Awards, Israel's Oscars. The film shows the Jewish civil war Josephus described. Jews killing Jews while Rome watched. The director Gidi Dar said he read Josephus in 2013 and was shocked. How can it be that I, and many of my contemporaries, do not know this story better? Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett called for the entire Israeli parliament to watch the film. The message was clear. Internal division destroyed our ancestors. It can destroy us again. Josephus, the traitor, became a warning for the present. And the debate over the Testimonium Flavianum, it remains more alive than ever. In 2025, T.C. Schmidt's book reignited the discussion. Computational analysis. New arguments. Old questions. Did Jesus exist? Did Josephus write about him? Did Christians falsify the text? How much of the Testimonium is original? Internet forums explode with debates. Atheists against Christians.
historians against apologists, skeptics against believers. Everyone cites Josephus. Everyone disagrees about what he said. The man who wanted to be remembered as a respectable historian became the center of a culture war he could never have imagined. But perhaps that is fitting. Josephus lived between worlds, Jew and Roman, rebel and collaborator, witness and propagandist. His entire life was ambiguity, and his work reflects that. He preserved the memory of the temple he watched burn. He documented the war he helped lose. He wrote the history of a people who rejected him. The traitor saved sacred history, not because he was holy, not because he was a hero, because he survived, because he wrote, because someone had to tell what happened. And in the end, maybe that is what matters, not the moral judgment of his choices, not the purity of his motives, but the blunt fact that without him, we would have lost almost everything. The destruction of the temple would be a void. The context of the Gospels would be a mystery. The only external mention of Jesus in the first century would not exist. Flavius Josephus was imperfect, ambiguous, possibly cowardly, certainly opportunistic, and absolutely indispensable. If you had been in that cave at Jotapata, surrounded by 40 men determined to die, with the Roman army waiting outside, what would you have done? Reflect, comment, share.